Welcome to Uncommon Core, where we explore the big ideas in crypto from first principles. This show is hosted by Su, the CEO and Chief Investment Officer of Three Arrows Capital, and me, Hasu, a crypto researcher and writer. Welcome to the second part of our conversation with Danny Ryan and Tim Beiko on the merge, which is Ethereum's upcoming transition to proof of stake. Proof of stake touches on so many parts in the protocol. It's such a complex upgrade that has been in the works for so long that we really couldn't, just do it in one episode. So in the first part, we covered, how consensus works, what's the difference between proof of stake and proof of work, and the potential trade-offs between the two. But also, what has the road to proof of stake for Ethereum looked like? How does it affect important topics like client modularity and diversity? And how did all of the Ethereum client teams test for such a massive event? In part 2, we're going deep on two topics that are also very closely related to proof of stake. The first being MEV, and the second Lido and the rise of liquid staking. So why Lido? Now that anyone who has ETH can, in theory, participate as a staker on the Beacon chain, there's a huge demand in order to delegate that stake to someone else who will, run a node and validate the Beacon chain for you with a very high uptime, so you can turn your ETH from a non-productive to a productive asset. And what Lido has done is give your ETH to these professional node operators, but also give you a derivative that represents this ETH that's currently being staked on the Beacon chain and allows you to do stuff with it in DeFi and on centralized exchanges. So it greatly lowers sort of the cost of capital on staking and basically turns, just regular ETH into a productive asset. However, Lido is the current market leader in this segment. Their rise has been very strong, so they make up currently 30% of the stake that is on the Beacon chain. And to be very clear, they delegate it to over 20 node operators, and they don't stake any of this themselves. But Danny Ryan, and who has been sort of one of the most outspoken critics of Lido and liquid staking, he has in the past sort of warned people to exercise some caution, maybe to put it mildly, and also ask Lido to self-cap their growth. And so we are very excited to hear from Danny Ryan today and dive deeper into some of these arguments, what he sees as the risks of liquid staking, and what he would like to see Lido to do, also what he would like potential competitors of Lido to do, and what are maybe arguments pro and against self-capping and other sort of techniques. The second topic that we are going to explore is the one of MEV. And MEV affects almost everyone on Ethereum. So if you have ever traded on a decentralized exchange before, then you've likely gotten front ran by bot operators. If you trade on a decentralized exchange and you cause a price impact, then there will be arbitrageurs sort of bringing the market price back in line. If you used the lending market before, then maybe you've gotten liquidated. So MEV definitely interacts with regular users of financial markets in many ways, but it also causes it has this almost existential risk on blockchains in general, as it threatens to centralize block production. That is because a lot of skill goes into extracting MEV, and if some validators are better at extracting MEV than others, then this has basically a very centralizing force on how the distribution of these validators can look like. And this is extra important after the merge, because what happens at the transition from proof of work to proof of stake is that the current node operators, the current validators on the Beacon chain, take over the Ethereum execution chain, and they start earning the fees and the MEV that currently goes to the miners in proof of work. And paired with this, reduction in the block subsidy that is sort of also the result of the merge, now MEV plays an even bigger role in the revenue that validators make today. And so it is even more important that we have a way to democratize access to all of the MEV to all validators. The company that sort of pioneered this approach of running a public market for MEV extraction via an auction system, and that makes these MEV blocks available to all miners today is Flashbots. And so Flashbots is where I work, and I'm very, very excited to, for the first time in his career, bring in one of our founders, the founders of Flashbots, and also a steward and architect of many of these systems, Stephane Gosselin, also known as the GoStep. Welcome, Stephane.
All right. Super excited to be here. I think this is an amazing episode. I can't wait to talk with both of you, Tim and Danny. I'm Stephane. So I'm one of the co-founders at Flashbots, also a steward and sort of the lead architect behind some of the products that we've launched. So MEV-Geth, sort of earlier on in the Flashbots journey, right? Software to help miners deal with MEV and introduce sort of a separation that allows them to outsource MEV searching. And then more recently, sort of the product that's ready for the merge, MEV-Boost, which will allow validators to do MEV and outsource MEV production on proof of stake Ethereum. So super excited to talk about all this.
Yeah, this is the reason that I really wanted to have you on for this episode, because of the intersection between proof of stake and MEV and how the merge is going to change proof of stake, and how Flashbots and the Ethereum Foundation are thinking in terms of addressing the problem of MEV. Yeah, so why don't we jump right into that? Could you give a small overview of what MEV-Boost is and how it relates to the status quo on Ethereum today?
I think the way that we can think about the MEV problem is a problem of unbundling the activity, the economic activity that a block producer does on a blockchain. So in proof of work Ethereum, before Flashbots sort of came around, miners picked up transactions from the transaction pool, and then they put them into a block, proposed a block to the network. What we saw, and the reason why we sort of wanted to introduce a new project here, is we saw miners starting to want to compete on having access to, or private access to hash rate. So miners developed private endpoints that allow them to receive transactions directly from bot operators in this case, and include those into their blocks. Construct them also in ways that didn't necessarily follow the traditional ordering. So there's a traditional greedy algorithm that orders transactions by the gas price that they're paying to the miner, to the Coinbase address. And they were starting to experiment with new approaches to ordering. So we wanted to introduce a new abstraction that would help users of Ethereum sort of express their preferences in a more complex way, while also maintaining the ability to communicate with the majority of miners at the same time. So that's what MEV-Geth sort of introduced, an ability to outsource the production of blocks and introducing new transaction types for miners. What it kept, however, is the job that miners have to aggregate all these transactions in a way that's optimal for block construction. So with a lot of the research that we did following the launch of this, we sort of discovered that block building, right, block construction remained a fairly sizable centralization risk because of the ability or the amount of specialization that goes into block construction. And we saw some of the miners also starting to specialize in this block building. So MEV-Boost, along with the merge, sort of does a further unbundling of this role, where it separates out the job of block building, of block constructions, completely from the job of proposing a block to the network and validating a block. And this is sort of the idea and the basis behind the concept of block builder, block proposer separation, which sort of has been introduced on the research roadmap for Ethereum.
And correct me if I'm wrong, there's another goal of MEV-Boost is that the existing way that the Flashbots architecture works with the mining today is that there's only so many participants that you could handle because of the requirement of kind of policing the theft of MEV, and that MEV-Boost also allows for kind of this relay actor to serve as this kind of coordinator and help bypass some of those scalability problems.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's an improvement in another way, which is like it's more decentralized in the way that Flashbots works today, because like the system in which Flashbots works today requires Flashbots to operate as sort of a watchdog over the transactions that are sent to miners and make sure that the miners aren't abusing, what they view inside of those transactions. In the MEV-Boost setting, the validators don't see the content of the payloads that they receive from builders at all. They only see the hash of the content. And so you don't need to do this policing anymore. There's some other sort of trust requirements involved, but at least it's not like a policing one. And it actually like shifts the onus of monitoring and of verifying that the system is healthy to validators. So individual validators become responsible for auditing the performance of the bundles that they receive. The net impact of this is that it allows any solo staker to participate in receiving optimal MEV blocks, right? Just like large pools would, and eliminate sort of the incentive for teams to specialize on performing MEV extraction at the pool level. And instead everyone has access to this open and sort of permissionless marketplace for blocks.
Okay, so I have another just question for you, Steph, if you can expand on MEV-Boost. Just in the naming, the first version of this was MEV-Geth, which is basically an extension to the Geth code base. And MEV-Boost was designed in a bit more of like a client agnostic way. So can you kind of walk through just basically how the diff works in practice to current clients and how that's changed from MEV-Geth?
Yeah. This was a really fun design process, right? Like we've sort of enumerated some of the features and the properties that MEV-Boost have. These were sort of all outlined from the start and were like requirements for how to design a better system for proof of stake. The other one was to support client diversity. So MEV-Geth was implemented as a fork of Geth, right? And what happened in early 2021, sort of overnight, the majority of miners all of a sudden were running this like third party fork of Geth, like 80% of the miners or something, which like I think Hasu has referred to it in this way before. Like this is kind of like a miner activated soft fork, right? Like it's a different client that's running and producing blocks. To like avoid this going forward, like the goal was to produce like a client that was completely neutral and agnostic to the client that's being run. So it's being implemented as a sidecar that just communicates with the standard consensus clients over sort of an API that's defined and very generalized for outsourcing block construction.
Yeah, I think if we didn't go down that path, we could wreck all the progress in client diversity overnight, as you said. Hasu, I take issue with the soft fork. Why? I don't know if it's a soft fork because it doesn't change the consensus rules. Like any node running is just going to see these as normal valid blocks. Why would you say soft fork?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think because there is an outcome to the system rules for most participants, even though they didn't opt into them. And I think that's like one of the core hallmarks of what a soft fork is. So, for example, if you're someone who's transacting on a decentralized exchange, then the miners activating the soft fork would make it all of a sudden cheaper for you to be sandwich attacked.
Right.
This would be one. But also other sort of behavior became possible, right? The ability on the flip side to get transactions mined privately if you also communicated with miners through the use of this client. So I think it's a bit like tongue-in-cheek because no transactions became invalidated as a result of this. But it definitely sort of happened without the explicit sort of opt-in of users.
It like restricts and it changes kind of the rules of how most blocks are produced. But if someone produces a block differently, it wouldn't be restricted out of the consensus. So I see the similarity and the difference there.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there is this one weird thing though. When you get 100% or close to it of hash rate running MEV-Geth, you've implicitly changed the rules in that like the majority of the hash rate, an overwhelming majority, will consider a block mined by MEV-Geth as valid if there's a bug in it. Whereas previously we had Open Ethereum was actually the second largest mining client. And because of a bunch of reasons that like stopped being true. So there's this weird thing where like if you had a bug in MEV-Geth, it could
be enshrined.
It could be, there's like a much greater probability that it would be enshrined than in the previous status quo where you had just, say, Geth and parity, both mining blocks. Yeah.
Which is more to the client diversity question and how baking this inside of a client kind of incentivizes the reduction of client diversity.
Yeah.
Which some of the second order effects is also you now have like a piece of software that's maintained independently of the client, like MEV Geth is. And it's actually probably a much more kind of safer in terms of software production and release cycles and stuff for this sidecar to be kind of a third-party piece of software as it's in MEV-Boost.
I'm much less stressed about making MEV-Boost releases than MEV-Geth releases.
I'm much less stressed about you making those as well.
To any listener who appreciated sort of the nuance on the miner activated soft fork, there's also this other, I think, nuanced idea, which is that I don't know how many people know that in proof of work, there was actually also an implicit form of commit reveal scheme happening between block builders and miners in the form of pools, because Flashbots was only able to scale in the first place with this role of the trusted miner because we only had to reveal the block content to the pool, and then the pool only sends the hashed block header to its workers, and then these workers, they hash the block header again with the golden nonce, trying to find the golden nonce, right? So
that was a function of how these pools already worked, right? Out of convenience, and you just kind of get to leverage that.
Yeah. Really fortunate, right? Because in proof of stake, every validator just falls, like it's almost like they fall back to being their own builder again, and you don't have this abstraction in the form of pools, right? In proof of work, someone who has a mining machine at home, they can opt into a pool and just sort of do work on the block that someone else built without knowing what's in it.
I mean, most miners that hook into pools probably don't run a node at all. Like in full implementation of the protocol, they're literally just running mining software.
Exactly, yeah. And this wouldn't be possible in proof of stake in the same way, right? If you run an Ethereum client at home and you want to have 32 ETH and want to run your own validator without MEV-Boost, it wouldn't be possible for you to perform the same kind of work on the block that someone else built. So you can think of MEV-Boost as like fundamental pool infrastructure as well, in a sense.
I think it might be interesting to talk about the kind of MEV-Boost tries to create proposer builder separation without L1, without layer 1 protocol kind of enabling it. Maybe it's worth talking about some of the downsides to this design as like bolted on rather than kind of integrated natively. And I think one of the big ones that comes to mind is that I, as a validator, I sign a block knowing what the value I'm going to get out of that block, but without knowing the full block, without knowing all the transactions. And then I now have signed this thing that I can be slashed for if I sign something counter to that thing. And now I'm beholden to someone else revealing the full block. And so you have some of these kind of withholding attacks, like potential liveness attacks. Maybe you have to deal with reputation a bit more because of the kind of the nuances around signing a blinded block, as we call it.
Yeah, it's not like a perfect solution. It's not what has come to be referred to as enshrined PBS because of these limited trust vectors. I think a lot of the design of MEV-Boost has been to limit the impact of it, eliminate liveness risk by having like easy ways for the client to fall back to normal block production, for example.
Yeah.
Being critical for having safety properties that work for Ethereum.
Yeah, I think another interesting part is not just falling back locally, but attempting to have it be attributable if some sort of relay or builder fails and is messing with people. So not only are validators signing things, but likely, the other side of the aisle would sign things. So that, there's some sort of like attributable nature to repeatedly not getting your block out if you're a builder or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe I can try to like describe a bit where that attribution comes into play. So sitting in between builders and validators in the MEV-Boost model, there are relayers. And relayers are sort of permissionless entity. Anyone can spin up a relayer and start accepting payloads from builders. The job of the relayer is to simulate that bundle, or score it, say like how much is that bundle worth, sign on top of the header of the bundle and how much it's worth, and then submit that to the validators that are sort of accepting payloads from this relay. So the relayers all sign and say, like, this bundle, I've simulated it, it's worth this much. And they also escrow the content of that payload. So when the validator returns back a signed block header, it can then like reveal the block to the network, and the entire network can see both who is the relay that signed the payload, what is the value that they claimed, who is the validator that accepted the payload, and was it revealed successfully to that network. So that attribution allows to have sort of collective data that you can use for building like reputation of the relays and help validators inform like which relays are high performance and trustworthy.
Yeah. So like the amount of value from the bundle, that's extremely attributable if they signed something that's false. The like timing around whether it was released on time and stuff is probably a bit more hard to get in aggregate, but I think many will be observing. So I think those reputation metrics are tractable as well.
Yeah, Steph, you just mentioned relayers, and I think one thing that might be useful for people who are not super familiar with the design is, can you like walk through the incentive of like the different participants to actually fulfill their role? If you look at just from like the proof of stake side, like the validator, they get paid or they get slashed. So like we have like these in protocol incentives for them to submit a valid block. But if you go from like, okay, they're like the proposer, but like, what are the incentives for like the builder? What are the incentives for the relayer? Who do you see in practice, like as actors filling up those roles? Just because it's like a very abstract design, and I think it helps people to get like, what's the type of entity that sits in each slot, basically, and why are they doing it?
Yeah, definitely. So right now, builders really are miners, right? They're miners who run either vanilla Geth or MEV Geth to have a bit more profitable block construction. In a MEV-Boost setting, anyone can run a builder. Anyone can start doing block construction, and they can pull transactions wherever they want. They submit it to relayers. So the relayers, I think, act very much so as RPC providers do today. So everyone who's like developing on Ethereum is familiar with companies like Infra and Alchemy, who provide sort of a routing service and a sort of a centralized RPC to route transactions to the transaction pool and get data from the chain. Like a similar thing happens here where you have a RPC provider who's specialized in doing simulation and routing payloads to validators from builders. In terms of incentives, right? Like relays are building a reputation, and they want to have the highest data availability possible, so that the issues like Danny mentioned of late reveals aren't a concern. So they're focused on high performant infrastructure, high throughput simulation, and uptime, and they'll charge for that service in one way or another, typically probably through like API request fees. In terms of builders, so builders are doing much more of an MEV job of optimizing block construction. So they'll say, like, based on all of the set of transactions I have available to me, what is the best way to combine them to create a block that has the maximum amount of value? There's multiple different types of builders. So some builders might like set constraints and say, like, I don't do certain type of ordering. Like anything that could be considered front running is not included in my ordering. Or a builder could say, I only do first in, first out ordering. So I include transactions only the way that I sort of receive them by the time that I receive them. Or they could say, like, I only want to use the vanilla ordering algorithm that exists within Geth today, which is like, I just order by gas price, and that's the only thing. So builders can order in whatever way that they want. But really sort of the way that they can monetize is if they build a block that's more profitable than the next builder, they can charge sort of a fee on top of that, like a spread in the value that they've created by creating a more valuable ordering.
I kind of see builders as, and this analogy does break down, but the role of kind of these high frequency trading firms that they're always kind of looking for the next strategy. They're always looking for a new edge. They're always looking to understand the markets in a way that for some amount of time, they can make something more profitable happen in trading and other things than others. And the builders aren't necessarily, well, the builders can be traders. They can insert their own transactions. But I imagine they're these highly specialized entities that are, they're doing a lot of research. They're doing a lot of like development to get transactions out of the network, get transactions out of private sources and stuff, and kind of inserting and recombining them in different ways.
Yeah, that's something I'm super excited to see is, in a way, this bundling of builder and miner together has limited innovation, right? Like limited innovation in the types of block construction that you can have and the types of products that you can offer users of Ethereum by having more sort of control over block construction, because miners or mining pools have historically been focused on doing other things. So if you open this up and make participation in block building permissionless and like pure competition, how many more features are these builders going to be able to provide to Ethereum developers and users to improve, the usability of the system? I think is a super exciting path of development here.
Yeah, and to me, this goes into like a similar discussion as we had before, which is, should we do MEV-Boost outside the protocol, or should we go straight to an enshrined version of PBS? And I think so. If you saw Barnaby Monod's talk, Barnaby from the Robust Incentives group of the Ethereum Foundation, he gave a great talk at MEV Day where he talked about this trade-off, and the way that he thinks about it is he wants to first let the market discover what like very good like market outcomes and market structures are like, and let these actors find the best way themselves, and then let us see how we can pull them into the protocol, make them more trustless if possible.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think something that will likely, there's something that's kind of not necessarily orthogonal, but very, very related. And any sort of L1 scheme that's going to deal with builders in protocol is also going to probably need to address this, and is certainly not addressed in MEV-Boost, is the censorship resistance. If we claim that builders are going to be this highly specialized entities that are firms that are doing lots of research to optimize, and it's kind of hard to maybe break into this market, there might be only a handful of them that are really like the strong market participants at any given time. And thus there's much more ability to knock on a handful of doors probably to censor things. And so I think there are these constructions that help enhance any sort of PBS, whether it's extra protocol or in protocol. But certainly when it comes in protocol, that try to layer censorship resistance back in, even when you assume this kind of external builder actor.
Yeah, there's, I think, super interesting research to be done here around, could you actually build like a censorship market on top of a builder construction, right? Like what does a builder who offers out a transaction type that says you can pay me to censor someone look like? And when you like take this thought experiment to the limit, I think you start to discover some of the like beautiful economic properties that blockchains have of censorship over multiple blocks being like prohibitively expensive, and that sort of any party that engages in that in a sufficiently competitive market is going to be doing so at like significant cost. So I think it's going to be a question mark of like what are the mitigation techniques that can be implemented at the protocol level for this. It seems like there's like a super promising area of research. And the other one is like just economically, how big of a cost is there for performing any sort of censorship.
Right, but it's not always about cost, right? If you have 3 entities and they live in maybe one jurisdiction, cost maybe doesn't matter, depending on who's asking for the censorship.
Exactly. So in that case, right, I'd sort of describe building as not being competitive enough,
right,
where there isn't the ability for someone else to come up and compete.
But in practice, though, like it does seem like that is one of the biggest risks. Like I think there are obviously like, call it like blockchain native censorship, which is like, yeah, I bribe these builders to censor these people specifically. I doubt that like regulators will engage on that front, right? Like they're not, regulators are not going to reach out to builders and give them an ETH denominated payment to censor, some country that they sanctioned. So literally they'll just make it illegal to have economic interactions with that country, for example. And even if you do have like decent jurisdictional distribution for builders, I do think that's like a major risk, because you can imagine a world where like 80-90% of jurisdictions can agree on something like a sanction, for example. And I think that is something that like at the protocol level, if builders could be almost like unable to discriminate at that level, where
it's a very difficult problem.
Yeah.
It's there's probably two avenues. One would be that they can't discriminate. They have to utilize the mempool as it is seen to some extent. But then that requires coming to consensus on the mempool.
Yeah, there is no mempool, right?
Right.
This might not be obvious, but everybody has their own.
It's funny how we rehash sort of conversations that have existed 6 years ago in Bitcoin Cash and about sort of zero conf transactions, right? So if you could have consensus on the mempool,
right, then
you wouldn't need proof of work mining.
Which you can't, but you can probably have kind of these alternative mechanisms where validator A at some prior slot makes a claim about a list of things, and such that list needs to show up at some point in the next few blocks. If not, the blocks become invalid or something. Yeah. There's weird stuff with incentives here, because all of a sudden you might, if you make these constructions naively, then that list just becomes for sale, similar to the rest of the block. But I think that there's an interesting design landscape there, at least.
Before we get sort of rabbit hole here, I want to zoom out a little bit and then double click on these concerns that we all have about builder centralization. So, Stephane, could you outline what is this risk of builder centralization? What are the forces that the economies of scale that sort of drive, one or a few large builders possibly to emerge?
Sure. So I think block builder centralization is one of the big open questions of MEV in general. How much does the natural economic forces of MEV lead towards single entities being sort of winner take all in the system? And how can you prevent these entities from having negative impact, if they do emerge, having a negative impact on the rest of the system? So what does a negative impact look like? I think you mentioned censorship. I think that's definitely one that's on top of mind. I think another one is just entrenchment. So doing vertical integration up and down the value chain, such that it becomes increasingly difficult over time for competition to emerge and sort of take over this winning position. So I published a talk and an article called The MEV Supply Chain, which looks at sort of this value chain from user to validator in a MEV context, and how it can sort of end up in two distinct futures. One of them, which is sort of more dystopian, of there being a single block builder that everyone interfaces with to be able to get their transactions mined on chain, or more utopian, where it's actually a network and sort of a market of independent competitive actors that are all bidding for inclusions in one way or another. And these are sort of the two potential futures I think we can be headed towards. And when we make a lot of these decisions on designing solutions, we have sort of a moral imperative to think about, is this decision leading more towards a utopic or more dystopian future? Does it lead towards more builder centralization or more builder decentralization? In the short to medium term, because a lot of these questions of how the ecosystem develops aren't answered, I think this is where social norms come into play and actually play a very big role in picking between these two futures. So not only do we want social norms that say, as an ecosystem, we will favor solutions that lead towards more decentralization, but I think that there can also be specific social norms in the type of activity that actors are engaging in that is sort of deemed helpful or less helpful towards decentralization, and having conversations about those is super important.
One thing that's also affected by the merge is, instead of a lottery determining who the next leader in block production will be, we now know the next, I don't know how many leaders in advance. So is there any impact on MEV as a result of this?
Certainly. I mean, people are exploring the domain of multi-block MEV and trying to leverage this, which, if unmitigated or regularly abused, can have centralization pressures, could have block timing pressures, such that if I have two blocks in a row, I don't release block one until I release block 1 and 2 at the same time. So I think there are some in protocol things that are under exploration. For example, if first block was released late, it would just be orphaned under normal considerations. Well, that's a hard problem, but in the ideal, you would expect it to maybe be orphaned. Additionally, yeah, there's a lot there. I think as well with the proposer, you can imagine a couple of additional things happening. You can imagine one single secret leader election, but also single secret leader election that does not have the predictability of, say, an epoch of 32 validators, such that it's just in time single secret leader election that might make things more difficult. But then again, if that block reveal actually reveals the next one, then you can abuse it as well. So, then there's a question of, well, is it not the block that decides, but maybe the attestate? There's a lot. It's kind of the implications kind of ripple outward, but there's a lot in our design tool belt that's being kind of explored to better kind of make sure MEV is on a level playing field, that it doesn't disrupt the kind of M protocol mechanics too much.
Do you think it's easier for applications to design resistance to multi-block MEV than it is for single-block MEV? Because you can imagine a lot of the naive strategies are like, you change the oracle price in the last transaction, and then you include your swap in the first transaction of a block. And naive applications might have some guards across, don't do too many updates in the same block or something like that. So those feel like they would be easy. You just say, instead of doing, one blocks, do N, where it's very unlikely that many blocks are controlled. But is that a naive view? Is it easier for an app to be resistant to multi-block MEV than single block, where they can't really control anything at the app level about where the different transactions in the block end up?
Well, I think it's always it's relying sort of on TWAP oracles, for example. So an oracle that sort of takes the average weighted price of the last, let's say, 20 blocks will always be more robust to manipulation than just relying on, the last block's price. And I think for any applications that use on-chain oracles at all, I think they have migrated to, this kind of TWAP oracle that's provided to them by Uniswap v3. I think that my view is that the sort of this leader transparency and the rise of multi-block MEV will definitely put us back in terms of the oracles that we can use on chain. Because, as you said, so applications can run a lot of checks before executing actions, but we see in practice they generally try to avoid even the most basic kinds of checks, because this is just stuff that you have to math operations that you have to repeat, that you have to perform on chain and repeat in every transaction, and they really do blow up your complexity and the kind of gas costs that users have to pay. So they love to sort of outsource this to, for example, Uniswap, which just performs the TWAP operation once per block for every pool instead of every app doing it itself. So in practice, this is what we have seen. And yeah, I think it's TBD, how usable this still will be after the merge.
Do you all think that either the fair ordering protocols or some sort of encrypted and then later revealed transactions, to just eliminate MEV, do you think those are actually fruitful design avenues or research avenues, or are they kind of just roadblocks?
Okay, I have two takes on this. I think the first one is that I wanted to make earlier, but I forgot. And I think a cool nuance about MEV-Boost that we didn't get to talk about is that it's actually completely neutral infrastructure that can, in the same system, house both builders that use fair ordering protocols and builders that use, an MEV auction, or a sort of more opinionated MEV auction that excludes sandwich attacks and so on, right? And this is all. So what MEV-Boost does is only provide this decentralized, more or less market for full block templates.
Okay, but you're saying that validators might choose to use builders that have strategies that are fair.
Yes.
Okay, because those strategies, if I'm just looking at the price, are likely not going to win.
Yeah. So they will be less.
But if we have known
profitable
participants and they have reputations and they always follow the strategy, I got it. Okay.
I was saying that first to say we might actually see in the wild competition between builders who use these different strategies, which I think can be really cool. But sort of my view on fair ordering protocols in general is they can't eliminate sort of the pressure for MEV, nor the existence of MEV itself. Right. So even if you have fully private transactions, then there's no front running possible. If, for example, as a user, I make a trade, I create a background opportunity because I unbalance the liquidity pool in DeFi, then if this cannot be immediately captured by the searcher,
Right.
then these state differences will just accumulate and move to basically top of the block arbitrage in the next block. And so what you get is you turn this game of bidding for MEV opportunities via the gas price, not the gas price, like the fee that's paid to miner in the auction.
Timing.
Exactly. You turn it into a latency war that replicates high frequency trading that we see in the traditional financial system.
Right.
And we think it's way harder to create a level playing field and low barriers to entry for participants in the supply chain if they have to compete on latency instead of price.
Certainly agree. I mean, with traditional, like New York Stock Exchange, there's a dozen entities that play the high frequency trading game at the highest level, and they have their fiber lines measured so they're exactly the same length, so they're all playing by the same rules.
Yeah.
We're not going to get there here. We'll see where it goes.
So I want to follow up on that conversation about multi-block MEV. To me, multi-block MEV is kind of a red herring. Like, there's not that much more that you can do aside from some maybe lowering the cost of Oracle manipulation in certain cases from an MEV perspective. But where things do end up looking quite a bit different, I think, after the proof of stake change is sort of perhaps lowering the cost of reorgs and like the impact that more frequent short-term reorgs might have on an MEV market. I think I'm looking specifically here and thinking about some of the other proof of stake chains that have sort of emerged over the last couple of years, and like noticing the frequency of reorgs in those and like the types of MEV strategies that bot operators have been engaging to make sure that they're able to be on sort of the winning reorg of the chain. So, the way that you can think of this strategy is if I control a large pool of the validator network, I can propagate like through a subnet for attestations from these validators ahead of attestations from like other validators and maintain sort of a second consensus like weighted chain that I can always like swap back to if I need to and have like more votes to exclude the block from some adversary somewhere on another chain. And we've seen these strategies be like extremely effective in other proof of stake chains. As Flashbots, we sort of made a decision not to build software that enables the development of or the extraction of like reorg based MEV, because it doesn't seem to be in line with sort of the ethos of a chain that just keeps moving forward and instead makes it move backwards. But I'm wondering how you all think of this from a protocol development perspective. Is this sort of a major risk?
I think as a general rule, there's like there's a many domains of these types of attacks around reorgs and subtleties that without MEV you might say, who's going to do that? But with MEV, all of a sudden you have like very incentivized actors for like each of these types of attacks. And so as protocol designers and researchers, like these are at the forefront of our minds, trying to find the correct constructions and the correct balance of parameters that make these hard or costly. I think right now in the Ethereum protocol, crypto economic security is not accumulated on a per block basis. It's accumulated on a per epoch basis. And so short range reorgs, although might be hard unless you control certain portions of the validator set, are not costly if you actually do them. And so all of a sudden things like single slot finality, which I think is a bit of a misnomer, it's more like cumulative crypto economic security on a per block basis. Those become very probably high priority on the kind of 2-year time horizon, because they do make these things that are now probably much more incentivized to be actually costly, which is funny. You then have you still have a bound, right? If there's a reorg and it's going to cost something, then if you have a high enough MEV, then all of a sudden it's going to become rational to induce such a reorg. But without certain mitigations, then you do have kind of the Flashbots view of it in that it's not in line with the chain's ethos. And so you do have kind of some second order effects protecting you. If I am a pretty large staker and I am doing things that are bad, whatever that may mean, I might be affecting kind of the stability of the chain. I might be affecting the kind of the implicit value of the chain and things like that. So you do have second order effects helping you, but we don't want to rely purely on those on the multi-year time horizon and get to a safer place in light of these types of attacks.
Okay, so that concludes our discussion on MEV, and I actually now want to transition to probably what many listeners, but also us here, have been waiting for. Let's talk about Lido. So to give a quick introduction, Lido is a decentralized staking pool protocol where, as a potential staker, you can give them Ethereum and they will allocate it to one of currently 22 professional node operators. These node operators will stake the Ether for you on the Beacon chain, and you receive what they call a staking derivative called staked ETH in return. And this accumulates the rewards from staking and can later be redeemed for ETH. It's just basically a representation of ETH that's being staked on the Beacon chain. And while Ethereum proof of stake has been designed with making solo staking as easy and accessible as possible, the outcome that we have seen in practice is quite a bit different, right? So Lido currently has around 30%, I believe, of all stake that is currently on the Beacon chain. So I have seen you, Danny, sort of come out with the tweet very recently. I'm curious, what is your thoughts on Lido and how has your thinking on this evolved over the last couple of weeks?
So the thinking has evolved over many, many months, not just the last couple of weeks. I personally believe that such constructions, although do mitigate some of the classic centralization risk. So, for example, if Coinbase had 30%, I do believe that there are kind of inherent risks in the pooling of these assets at certain protocol thresholds, call it 20%, 33%, 50%, that kind of stuff, that we're not really acknowledging as existent due to smart contract risk, due to governance risk, due to, well, governance is, I think, a big one, especially considering the ratio of the assets staked versus kind of the governance, the value of the protocol, the token that governs the protocol, also the number that govern the protocol. Then you add in pooled rewards and you add in MEV and different things. I think this type of protocol becomes kind of a natural stratum for cartelization of the protocol. And I would, my personal view is that I wish there was better competition in this space 12 months ago, which there's not. Lido's made a great product. By all means, like, these guys have an exceptional product. They got in front of all the, any competitor by 12 months easily. But, I'd hope that there's one, better competition in this space. Two, an acknowledgement of the risks that exist by both capital allocators and the people considering the protocol. Because I think there's risks. There's two types of risks. There's risks to those putting capital into a system at certain thresholds. There's also risks to the protocol. I think that individuals allocating capital will certainly price and should price the risks to their own capital. I think it's much harder, if the risks are purely to kind of the protocol and maybe cartelization, it's much harder due to the tragedy of the commons for individuals putting capital into it to price it. But nonetheless, I think there are many risks here. I think it's very important for people to discuss the risks. I think it's very important for competition to emerge. And I also think it's important for those in the Lido community to kind of consider and acknowledge what has happened in proof of work protocols for quite a long time. Pools have self-restricted. Easily in Bitcoin and in Ethereum, there could have been pools that did exceed the 50% threshold. I remember a number of times in the past that, a pool would kind of get there and all of a sudden there's a big conversation and people are like, oh no, and then the pool would self-restrict because of the kind of second order effects on the security of the protocol and the impact of kind of the view of the protocol.
To just hook into the question of like comparing mining pools and staking pools, because do you think that they're actually comparable? Because in proof of work, the mining pool is the one building the blocks, whereas in Lido, sort of, it's the node operators who all are individually incentivized to make good blocks, and Lido has direct.
I did note that I think in the normal case that the distribution of node operators underneath such a Lido protocol is actually, it's better than if Coinbase had 30%. And I'll get to that in a second. The mining pools are very interesting because the capital allocation is actually much more liquid. So if I actually don't like a mining pool, I can move over much more quickly. That becomes more possible post-merge, but it's not really possible at this point. But I do believe that because of the levers at play, the governance levers, because of upgradability, which I know is attempted to be minimized over time with Lido, but because of a whitelist of operators, because of the reputation required to be an operator or not, and the governance levers there, I do believe that in the extreme that governance can coerce this capital to operate as in a unified way. Whether it be deep attacks, very likely not. It's probably not like a 1/3 slashing event through a concerted attack to double finalize and double spend. It's probably much more insidious in multi-block MEV, in short-range reorgs, in that kind of stuff that due to the way the whitelist may work and due to the kind of pooled rewards and penalties, that I think that you kind of have some insidious things that emerge.
Tim, do you have a sort of your own view, or would you subscribe to what Danny has said?
I definitely agree with the vast majority of that. I think the one thing that's interesting to me as well is if you look at something like Lido, the two biggest problems are, one, you have on-chain governance, and then two, you have a whitelisted operator set. And unfortunately, they kind of balance each other out in that if you make the protocol more trustless, there's less things you can do on-chain to fix things, and actually having off-chain relationships with operators makes it easier to mitigate issues. So imagine a world, Lido completely abandons on-chain governance, and then there's a fatal flaw in the STS token, right? And if there's only these 22 node operators that you mentioned, the Lido community can get together with the 22 of them, deploy a new contract, and kind of agree that this is the new STETH and the other one is worthless, something like that, right? So you can recover some scenarios because you have off-chain trust with the operators. But that's another one of the problems in Lido is you do have this off-chain trust. So that means that there's another failure mode where it's it doesn't even have to be malicious to the protocol, but it can just be they do not let other operators join the whitelist because, they've established a dominant market position and they make a ton of money. And so why split it with more operators, right? They could just choose to restrict that set. So then there's this other kind of critique where you would like some sort of less permissioned way for people to join Lido, maybe having a bond or having metrics, whatever. But then if you have that and there is an on-chain issue, you don't have a guarantee that you can actually, contact these operators in as efficient of a way. So I think this is the other thing. I would add there is a weird catch-22 there. And if you solve the governance thing and you make Lido completely trust minimized, then you're kind of going to rely on the off-chain relationships that you have as much more of a crutch and vice versa.
And I do believe that Lido can be designed iteratively and better over time. I don't believe that all of the risks of centralization can be mitigated, nor do I believe that governance can be entirely eliminated. And I do, say you put in an upgradability kind of time bound where if those that didn't want to participate in whatever the new rule set is could have time to exit, which is good, because in the extreme, probably you can't have, the theft ratio issue where, a small amount of Lido governance tokens and governance holders could steal all of the staked ETH, can be diminished over time. But I do think you don't really eliminate, I think in the extreme, you don't eliminate, you don't really have the choice that would imply, because if staked ETH becomes systemic, then, minor changes to the way the rules are going to be operated and minor changes to how things that kind of compound over time, don't really become reason enough to leave. But you still have kind of this kind of extra protocol governance force on maneuvering and steering kind of things by a small minority.
Yeah, on one point I'll add on that as well, it's worth noting for listeners, is Lido is multi-chain, right? Staked ETH is the biggest product, but there's a bunch of other chains. And it is still the same LDO governance token that acts as governance for what happens on these other chains. The token lives on Ethereum, but if I was another chain than Ethereum, there is this weird incentive misalignment where, say that the Lido Ethereum community wanted to be very hostile to the Lido Avalanche community or something like that, they can pass a governance vote on Ethereum and affect, how ST AVAX or whatever is managed. And as an Ethereum person, I sleep fine at night because Lido is mostly like an Ethereum product. But I think that the solution there is you definitely want some mechanism for individual chains to be able to veto or like block or extend a delay on changes initiated by LDO holders.
I think that's actually a design being explored. I think the intention over time is to study a governance model that can incorporate, say, staked ETH with ETH upgrades, or staked a whatever that token's called with their types of upgrades, which I think makes sense. And again, I agree. I believe that these designs should be made better. And I'm excited. I know the Lido community is like very interested in trust minimization, but I think the Lido community is very cavalier about the risks involved in the centralization. And I challenge others that are getting involved in the protocol to question the proposed lack of risks.
So let's take a step back. I like to play these thought experiments. I like to play them with MEV. Where would we be if there were any flashbots today? How would the market have played out otherwise? And I think I would like to play the same thought experiment here. Where would the market be if there wasn't Lido? So I think we can start from this assumption that users have ETH, they want to stake their ETH and they want to earn yield, but like 99% of them are not going to run their own validator. Like we even know it would be deeply uneconomical for many reasons if it weren't for MEV-Boost, if it's not for like pooling of rewards and smooth payout functions and all of these things, right? So what do you think would have happened?
So a couple of things there. I do believe that 99.9% of users are not going to self-stake, even if you make it incredibly easy, because this is not what they're going to do. But I think it's a very important part of the protocol to increase the amount of independent operators, to increase the amount of independent nodes, to increase censorship resistance in the extreme, and other types of things. And so people do that. And I think actually, if you look at some of the graphs early on, likely there was a pretty high portion of kind of solo stakers, whether they be staking 32 ETH or staking 32,000 ETH. Even there were some large whales at the beginning. But I think that's diminished over time, because I think there's kind of the amount that wanted to do so kind of got in. And I think you have some growth here and there. I think you have new people come online. But there's always going to be demand, certainly, for a significant portion to be professionally operated. I definitely agree with that. And so then I guess the thought experiment is supposed to point me in the direction of, would it be well distributed, or would it be naturally increasingly centralized over time? And I think that without a Lido product, that you probably would tend to see centralization and under a few large operators, and that Lido does, for the amount of capital that shows up, distribute nicely to more operators underneath the hood. I do think that, based off of conversations and based off of historically what we've seen in different avenues, that large exchanges and others that hold are large custodians of capital would self-cap. And I think that Lido gives us this kind of like middleware where we think it's okay to not, when you exceed certain thresholds. And so I think that's one of the big differences here is that Lido, in this version of reality where Lido exists, we have a bit of a backdoor into increasing the capital under one system beyond certain thresholds. And I don't think that you get that as naturally in a non-Lido world. I do think, in terms of the thought experiment, I think the Lido world, or some version of it, is probably inevitable because smart contracts exist. And the way that kind of capital can be put under the control of smart contracts here in this system. And so I'm in a Lido world and I'm trying to make the best of it. And I hope that there's 5 more Lidos and a lot of exploration and competition in this domain.
So I think if we, no matter what reality we want to live in, right now we live in a reality where Lido exists. And also, some people believe that the staking market is sort of naturally very centralizing. Fortunately, we have the ability to build reasonably decentralized, or progressively decentralized staking pools in order to sort of feather that risk, which I think otherwise completely depend on what you describe as, self-regulating or self-capping their stake, which, even though it has worked for mining pools, I've never been satisfied with that solution. We always knew that, for example, some of the Asian mining pools had exactly the same owners. And for most of the history, they probably operated way more than 50%, just put a different label on it, right? And so I think that we should be genuinely curious and excited for ways to build legitimately decentralized staking pools, but also I think be very wary about the risks that exist. And I think Lido has done a reasonably good job at that, sort of always coming out and saying, so what risks do we personally pose for the protocol, and please hold us accountable, and here's how we are currently thinking about addressing these.
I agree. When I say attack, I don't mean the bad guys. I do disagree with some of the approach taken here. I think spending millions of dollars a month on DeFi incentives when you've reached 30% of stake capital is maybe a bit nefarious. But I don't think these are the bad guys. And I think they've attempted to design a very good protocol and attempt to refine that and be open about some of the risks over time. I also don't think that self-capping is the only solution. I do think Stephane was talking about earlier with Flashbots, just kind of the assessment of risks, the ethos of the kind of community and the structure there can have a lot of impact over time and how this capital is allocated. But I will also say there are, in the event of, say, a Lido supermajority is in equilibrium for some amount of time, the protocol is resilient to being attacked. The protocol, in the event that there's kind of in protocol attacking, capital can be burned. And in the event that there's some sort of nefarious activity that cannot be slashed in protocol, the Ethereum community and those users of the protocol, which are not just those that hold ETH, can ultimately fork out that attacking capital. That's not something you want to get to, but it is, even similarly to centralization concerns that we've talked about for many, many years of capital under a central operator, the same recovery modes exist for this. And it's kind of nice in Lido's case, it's extremely attributable.
So I have a question about capping. So I think right now it's a really bad approach because users of Lido are basically locked in, right, until there's withdrawals on the beacon chain. And there is a curve pool, but obviously that does not accommodate all the volume and it's not like a proper exit. And behind the scene, the ETH is still staked with the same operators. Do your views change about a cap in a world where we do have withdrawals? And it's almost a world where then you can abstract it on chain, right? You can have almost a router which will withdraw from the certain operators and then move it to another operator. Yeah. So once we do have withdrawals, does that change your views on a cap?
I think that a cap's a personal issue within Lido governance and those that operate that product. I don't think that a cap on their product really changes in terms of post-merge or pre-merge. I don't see why that is a very important inflection point on how they'd consider kind of the economics of such a cap. Well, can you explain that again?
I think one possible explanation for why Tim's question makes sense would be that right now, the switching cost between Lido and these different providers is higher. So in case Lido ever were to exert undue pressure against its node operators, then right now, the people staking with Lido have no way to escape from the system. But after the merge, maybe especially if sort of forced withdrawals are enabled, then they could just switch, freely. And there's really nothing that Lido could do about it, except for the argument that you already gave. If staked ETH were sort of the de facto ETH, then they would have to exit into a much smaller token potentially.
I think the other thing that withdrawals change with caps. So imagine a cap today. There's two ways you can implement it. One is, you block deposits to the smart contract, you just literally revert them past an amount. And then what you're saying...
Oh, you mean an in-protocol cap? Like L1 capping it?
No. A Lido smart contract cap,
okay.
Right? So there's two things you can do. One is the Lido mint function stops working, right? Or the STF mint function. And so what you're saying then is only the users who have deposited before the cap can enjoy sort of the service that Lido offers. which maybe is not the end of the world, but it does kind of, create this two-tiered.
I think you would see a really fun scenario where staked ETH would trade at a pretty big premium to ETH.
Right, yeah, that as well. And then the other way to implement the cap
I want to get in, let me in.
Let me in!
Because Lido right now socializes rewards across people who are also in the deposit queue, as I understand it.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
So then if you have a cap, the easy way to implement a cap in Lido is you probably just leave people in the deposit queue kind of forever. But then that's a griefing factor across all the current ST holders, because you can just like park your ETH there, earn yield, and dilute it for everyone. And you can just kind of keep doing that over time. So it's like there's just weird situations you end up in.
Yeah. It's at least a costly griefing factor. You gotta, to grief someone's ETH, you gotta put in an ETH.
But you also get paid though, because you also get the, part of the rewards, because you're gonna be, So it's like a weird.
Sure, but you would argue you could put it somewhere else and get more rewards.
Yes. But it's an opportunity cost griefing, in fact, not like a cost.
And to the framing of like how a cap maybe is more beneficial now than later because they have optionality later. I'm not worried about like on the 12 to 18 month time horizon. I'm not worried about kind of the systemic, types of attacks here. I think it's more on the kind of 3, 5, 10, 20 year time horizon that I think these attacks become increasingly scary. So I don't,
That's interesting. Oh, sorry.
I mean, I put the limit in now if you're going to put the limit in, but I'm just saying, it doesn't really, the difference between what happens now and in 6 months from now isn't.
Okay. I lose much more sleep over the next 1 to 3 years than the next 10 to 30 years. I think like the odds that like we make it, and this is true also for MEV, I think like there is like a perfect path, 5 years away where we've like fixed these issues and we just have like this great world. And I think there's like a pretty good chance we get there. And my fear is just like, we just like fuck it up sometime in the next 3 years.
That's
because of like some bad decision. And so, I'm much more, I think we're going to make it, but I think it's like we're walking this very, very narrow road and like one, bad step, we just fall off the cliff.
And I guess I agree with that sort of risk assessment. So maybe I'm just worried about everything all the time. What keeps me up at night is designing something that kind of works now because there's the cultural norms or because everyone's generally aligned. But what really worries me is like if in a few years this isn't what I want to do and I don't want to steward it and like it kind of ossified, what happens in 10 years? What happens in 20 years? Is it actually resilient to those types of time horizons and the types of attacks and issues we might see on there?
So we talked about sort of this idea that, Lido could be throttling its own growth. And I think, as a holder of staked ETH, I think I actually want them, to keep growing for a very simple reason that the more other people are staking via Lido, the more useful the staked ETH asset becomes to me, right? It becomes more liquid, finds more adoption in DeFi where I can use it, etc. So in a sense, like
liquidity begets liquidity.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean,
I have a question though.
Mm-hmm,
Do you think that the second order effects or third or fourth order effects, whatever they may be, that to the Ethereum platform, for that to kind of meet its extreme, do you think that keeps ETH in a valuable place, or do you think that kind of brings systemic risk in that maybe challenges the value of being part of that? And obviously you have kind of the tragedy of the commons as an issue here, but just in the extreme, what do you think?
I think you're hitting on the exactly right point, which is that it has very positive first order effects. And I would say the effects are actually, it's almost like we're creating a completely new asset here. It's like, if you imagine ETH to be like cash today, then the idea that you can stake ETH and use it the same way that you use ETH today is almost like sort of the leveling up from cash to a bank account where you just, you trade in deposits with other people and can transact them seamlessly while also lending them out, and the capital gets sort of put to use in a productive way in the economy. So I think it's almost sort of that moment for Ethereum. And just as a staker, I think the first order effect for me, is great if that continues. And I also want, more people to sort of enjoy this benefit of having this asset, and I want them, I want to be able to trade with them. So I just want to be like, I think make clear, like, I think the first order effects of this are really great. And I think where it gets really very interesting is sort of the second and third order effects, which down the road, definitely, if Lido weren't to, decentralize, as we all hope it does, then I think definitely then you get into a precarious situation there.
And one thing, I think this is the thing I disagree the most with, say, you wrote this piece with Georgios about liquid staking leading to monopoly. I appreciate the returns to scale. Like, I get the argument that obviously you want Lido to be on DeFi. Even if it's not on DeFi, you want to have the STF token have high volume and stuff. Like, you want liquidity, and that has a ton of positive reinforcing cycles. What's not clear to me is, when do those stop? Because it kind of feels like if you have an asset that's, say tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars in market cap, like, you have liquidity for all intents and purposes, right? Like, for most people. And so a world where, say, there's like 4 staking derivative with like a 10 to $100 billion market cap or something seems like one where like you do get those benefits, but you also don't have the systemic risk. So yeah, I'm curious how you think about that, because it's like, I get there's like a level why you want liquidity, but past a certain point, it's like the risks to the protocol might outweigh the additional benefits. And as an end user, like today, I like to think of it as stable coins. USDC or USDT or DAI all have like deep liquidity, and you can trade in and out of them and use DeFi with them, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's still an open question whether these stable coins can survive sort of in the state that they are, or if there will be some more like centralizing outcome among them.
I'm optimistic that there are designs, alternative designs, and not just alternative designs, but market valuable, designs that are valuable to the market that Lido has not explored, and wouldn't be covered by their construction, and that, in the coming year that we see a number of these pop up and maybe give Lido a run for the money, such that you do have, like, there's a reason DAI exists, there's a reason that USDC exists. And there's a
reason Tether exists. Like, I think,
well, yeah, if you need more money, you print more money, obviously.
No, but what I mean is, if you take like USDC and Tether, they have very different risk profiles, but it's like great that both of them exist, right? And
I guess I don't know enough about UST recently.
I would not sleep well at night if like USDC was the only stable coin on Ethereum. Like, that would feel like a systemic risk to me, and nothing against them in particular, but it's like, yeah, I like that we have different ones with decorrelated risk profiles.
Yeah, I think that's valuable. I mean, I think it's systemically valuable. I hope that it's valuable in users.
I have 2 follow-up questions to this. First one for Danny. So what kind of designs do you think we haven't explored in decentralized staking pool?
Well, one's very obvious, and it's not decentralized. It's the USDC of staked assets, some sort of large centralized provider. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I do believe
but like
that
Coinbase has that, right? It's just you cannot withdraw it from the exchange.
Oh no, on chain.
Oh, I see.
On-chain derivatives.
If you could withdraw, basically, if you could withdraw your staked ETH, whether it's at Coinbase or another place, so you get the SD ETH, but there's no LDO token. It's like managed by a company, right?
I'm not claiming that that's necessarily a good thing. I'm claiming that might be valuable to some users in a different way to staked ETH, and I would be surprised if we didn't see something like that. I do think that you can, the Rocket Pool collateralized version, that just does not have the types of kind of network effects. Like, you just can't scale that as quickly, so that I don't think that's really competitive here. I do think that there is a new tool coming in the wheelhouse that I'm sure Lido will be exploring, but I think there's going to be a lot of like interesting things to explore for new companies as well getting in. And that's DVT, distributed validator technology, just to more kind of trustlessly combine node operators, potentially lower the barrier to entry. Obviously, that can be leveraged by Lido, but I think that kind of marks an inflection point where a bunch of new people can maybe jump into the game to play with new things. But surprise me. I think that there are very likely some things in here that I'm not keen to, and that the market will kind of play with over the next year or so.
I want to raise build a bridge to something we already talked about, which is proposer builder separation, right? So we have discussed that Lido, like the risk that Lido could exert pressure on its node operators to, include specific payloads, which might be bad for the Ethereum chain. So I'm curious, like both Steph and like you two as well, how you think about, Lido outsourcing its entire block building to a decentralized block building market like MEV-Boost or PBS, and if this would sort of alleviate some of your concerns.
I think that it's likely that large operators or large consortiums of operators actually become kind of MEV powerhouses in and of themselves. So I think that if they outsource naively, then in the normal case, maybe you don't have kind of the cartelization and the maybe interblock MEV or short range reorgs that maybe having that much capital would incentivize. But I think a large enough actor is incentivized to do one of two things: to have either special relationships with such a market where they're saying, I'm the next three proposers, help me out, or to be large enough for them to not need the market and to do the MEV research and the searching and stuff in the context of their very special situation. And I think that's one of the reasons that MEV-Boost is very important, is such that even a 30% operator, isn't going to get outsized opportunity with respect to, a solo at-home operator. But in the extreme, you pass certain in protocol thresholds, especially 50%. The solo operator with the opportunities that begin to look kind of like attacks, short range reorgs and stuff. The solo operator, even with a sufficient market, isn't going to be able to participate unless they join the cartel, of course.
Is this really true, Stephane? Could we build multi-block MEV into Flashbots?
Certainly. The answer is certainly.
Is this an information hazard question?
So you're saying it's a moral imperative, in a sense, that a builder gets big enough that they can extract multi-block MEV and make that available to all validators?
I'll put it this way. I'll say, like, if the blockchain requires like the majority or like a cartel of validators to be benevolent for it to like continue moving forward, it's probably not a blockchain anymore. So it probably is not a good outcome to have like software that requires that. If we actually think, okay, there's only a bounded risk of short-term reorgs and we have epoch finalization anyways, maybe it's fine. Maybe like we want to stress test the system and see what happens if there is infrastructure for performing short-term reorg at scale that is inclusive. So that allows even solo validators to participate in the reorg game. I think that is like a design space that could be explored.
Well, that's already a step further, right? From just multi-block MEV, which is just forward-looking.
Cartels as a service.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah. I mean, if the market trends towards cartelization, for example, between mining pools and searchers, then the only way that you can, what you can do is like make this cartel public, right? And make it so that anyone can join it and make it accessible to all participants, both up and downstream of the supply chain. And I think this is actually the right way of thinking about what Flashbots has done so far, right?
And there's, I'll go back to some of the in protocol stuff. At a certain point, block slot, which is kind of further incentivizes blocks arriving on time, and single slot finality or single slot cryptoeconomic accumulation. These types of things, I think, on the 2, 3, 5 year time horizon are very important refinements to the protocol to reduce the impact of cartelization as a service. And the impact to users ultimately. This is a thing for users. And if you regularly have 5 block reorgs to optimize profits for those running validators, whether they're in a cartel or running at home, it's important to that has an impact on users, and that's the reason to remember that we would continue to refine and harden these things.
We talked about MEV and Flashbots and MEV-Boost. We talked about Lido and staking. So I think I want to, for the final chapter, take a step back and see. So both Flashbots and Lido is kind of a new trend, right? It's protocol external projects that are playing very important roles in the protocol that are both very adjacent to sort of the core infrastructure of the protocol and very important for its security, both in the short and long term. As the Ethereum Foundation, how do you think about the existence or the rise of these protocols, and how do you manage your interactions with them?
We are looking for solutions that help make the protocol more stable, more robust, and ultimately valuable to kind of the end users and communities that use these. So when we're thinking about, say, interacting with Flashbots, the EF isn't thinking about, okay, what's Flashbots' revenue model? Is this going to help them or hurt them? It's more of, can we collaborate to find better solutions that help enable the markets, that help stabilize the protocols and things like that. And we found, especially with Flashbots, that there's actually been a lot of really nice overlap in the goals here, right? I think Flashbots does want an open market. Flashbots does want a stable protocol. And so in doing so, when we're exploring both extra protocol designs like MEV-Boost or in protocol designs like Enshrined PBS, we've been able to kind of collaborate very fruitfully. It really kind of depends on the alignment of the project with the ethos of kind of stabilizing, hardening, decentralizing Ethereum. And if we generally have alignment there, we usually can figure out how to collaborate.
Yeah, and one thing I'll also add is beyond the EF, the other like really critical people are like the client teams themselves, which again, in case people are not aware, there's many of them, the vast majority, every single one of them except Geth is not within the EF. And having them interact as well is like a really valuable thing. So I remember when like Flashbots kind of first started off, Thomas from Nethermind, Thomas is the founder of Nethermind, and he started getting involved in Flashbots. I had like a long call with him, and like he had like reviewed like the MEV-Geth code base, and that made me sleep better at night. I was like, if like Nethermind is generally, on board with this and happy, and like, and at first the concerns were a bit different. It was like, is there something in Flashbots or like an MEV-Geth that could create like a really bad block in Geth and like, cause like a consensus bug on the protocol? So it was much more, I guess, basic concerns in that way. But having Thomas, kind of review that and be part of it and like be involved in the design, like I think it was really valuable. So I think that's like the other bit as well, is like assuming these teams, genuinely do want to collaborate and like build like a good solution, putting them in touch with like the teams who write the protocol software is really helpful. And a bunch of people are in touch with like Flashbots now for MEV-Boost. The Lido team has reached out to a bunch of client teams also to get some feedback and potentially run some nodes. So I think like kind of broadening the set of people to interact with. So make sure it's not just like EF researchers, but also like all the different teams who build the infrastructure. And this goes beyond, also, it's not just like a Flashbots and Lido thing. Like, I mean, we talk with Infra, we talk with Coinbase, we talk, Foundry. Like when these like infrastructure providers want to interact, like, just I think putting them in touch with the folks who like build the protocol and you do kind of want to do some screening, like, because you don't want to like DOS the people working on the protocol. And this is where just making sure these teams are kind of aligned with what we're trying to build is valuable. And then when they're not communicating why we think that, and like, there have been projects in the past that have built like protocol adjacent things that have some weird incentives, and we've communicated why we thought it was a bad idea, what we thought was broken, making sure we modulate the amount of interaction based on how aligned we are and how valuable it is for protocol devs and researchers to spend time on this.
Yeah, it's like, given that it's an open source ecosystem and it's a very open project, everyone has a seat at the table. The EF has certain things that we're attempting to do. And when we're aligned with any sort of ecosystem actor, we're usually very happy to kind of work with them towards common goals.
Should I talk about the other side of the table?
Absolutely.
So I've been building on Ethereum since like 2017, and I've seen like this playbook happen a lot of time. I think the position of credible neutrality that the EF and like all EF researchers and builders are in can be like at sometimes comical, but at some other times like absolutely necessary. So on the comical side, there's like an obsession with like renaming things. Like anything that is like produced externally is going to get like for sure renamed before it gets any sort of rubber stamp from
What's an example? What's an example?
I think PBS is probably like an example of that, but there's like millions of others. Even at like the standards level, everything gets like renamed a million times. But that's just like part of the joy of collaborating in sort of an open source manner. I think what ultimately makes it really fun to work with the EF is just the intellectual honesty and the commitment to like principles that they've laid out for the organization. Where, you know, if you're working more in an industry setting and looking at partnerships and collaboration, everything sort of ends up reducing down to like some type of like negotiation over power and economics. And that just doesn't happen with the EF. Like it's always just negotiating on like the technical, like what is actually the best way to achieve technical objectives, which really makes it like a joy from like a design perspective. There's obviously a lot of open-mindedness. I think one place that there has been frustration in the past for various different projects has been that because, you know, it's not, the EF is not like an industrial body. It is like a bunch of like individuals that are collaborating on building things. It can seem difficult to like engage with. It can seem difficult to access and know who to talk to, like how to build the relationships to be able to have, you know, to be in the conversations and be at the table.
And sometimes I imagine you have a conversation with party A and then like you have to rehab the conversation with party B because they're not communicating. They don't know what's going on and they might have different views on things. Yeah, the EF kind of, for better or for worse, mirrors a lot of kind of the open source ecosystem. It's a bunch of different teams working on different projects that have certainly common goals at its core, but it's not like when you interact with an individual or team at the EF that you're interacting with the EF necessarily at large.
And almost in a lot of cases, team is a bit strong of a word. Like you can imagine, you know, having a conversation with Danny and one with Justin Drake and with Dankrad and getting three different.
With that group, you're definitely going to get three different answers.
Yeah. And so, you know, I sympathize with like, if you're an external project coming in and you're like, you know, Danny, Dankrad, Justin, what should we do? And they tell you three different things. And you're trying to figure out what the EF thinks, it'll be hard. So I do think like high level, obviously in terms of values and like vision for the protocol, there's like a ton of alignment, but it's also probably a bit hard given that there's not like a party line on every single topic, right? Like we do have a bunch of independent people who like think about this stuff and come to different conclusions. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think this has been such a great discussion. Thank you so much, Danny and Tim, for participating, and also Stephane for I think this has been your first podcast appearance.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Incredible. We are so glad that you chose Uncommon Core.
Oh, that's fun.
As the place to make your splash.
Your day.
Fantastic. So, yeah, guys. Have a good evening.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks for having us again.
Yeah, thank you. Both parts were great.
Bye-bye.
Talk to you all soon.